Welcome to another episode of Artist Spotlight, the podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Stringer. And as always, the podcast brought to you in conjunction with your friends from the Maryland Photography Alliance, where you can check out everything they have going on in terms of photography, education, events, meetups, and contests. It's just a very good resource for you to be able to tap into wherever you're based and learn more about photography and the career and the hobby, the interests that we all have and enjoy. And it's a great way to connect with like-minded people to improve your craft. And so, I want to mention this episode. We have a very special guest, Mr. Gaston Shutters, has been kind enough to join us. And he is a photographer. He is a company founder, and we'll get into that a bit. And just really a fascinating guy who I had the pleasure to meet a couple months ago in New York at the Leica 100th anniversary event. And just really hit it off and talked a little bit and just decided we should take this on the air. And so with that, from warm Miami, Florida, I want to welcome Gaston Shutters to the podcast. Gaston, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Mitch, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here.
You have done a lot from a YouTube perspective, and that's probably the first time that I became aware of you. And I think maybe where a lot of people have come to know you, talking about different equipment, whether it's cameras or lenses, in some cases accessories. And I think a lot of times people think, oh, I have an opinion. I want to share my opinion, or maybe people ask for my opinion. What made you get into YouTube as a way to communicate your thoughts about things that you find interesting?
Well, it was actually kind of like an accident. I used to shoot a lot of product photography. Like I mentioned before, I own a studio. I was doing a lot of catalogs, and I often would get people, ask what cameras I use, what lenses I use. And I thought it would be a great idea to, create some videos about the things that, that I used. And someone actually told me, you should check this guy on YouTube. I don't remember who it was. And it was another photographer. And I'm like, it makes sense. I'm already doing this. I just shoot it and then I can pour the content on YouTube and that way, help others that may be asking for that type of information. And it started something like documenting a little bit of my behind the scenes at the studio and talking a little bit about how I light things up and the gear I use, the lenses I use. It was evolving into what it is right now.
Well, one of the things that impressed me about you and the way you go about your channel is I feel like I'm going to sort of compare and contrast here. So I'll start off with what I don't like. And naturally, this is my opinion, but I don't like when you have folks who are doing camera reviews. And number one, they're not really active photographers. That they don't get hired to shoot, and shooting is something they enjoy, and that's great. But it's not, to use the phrase, mission critical. And when something is critical and you're getting paid and hired and fired based on the output, I think the credibility of recommendations is a bit higher, because you're not going to use something that doesn't work or doesn't work reliably. And you also have people who say, I only had a week with this camera, and here's what I think, or it's a pre-production version. Well, that's not an accurate representation of the finished product, which the public would buy. And so in seeing your channel, these are products that you purchase with your own money, that you use in the field, that you show your work. And I just think from a credibility standpoint, to me anyway, that's different than a lot of the content that I personally see, on YouTube and online. And, maybe you could just kind of speak to being a person who's buying the equipment, using the equipment versus just having, 48 hours or so with loaner gear.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, and we see it a lot. I personally review equipment that I use, period. I may review a new product that I find interesting, and I would say that, while I'm reviewing this product, but I usually try to stick to things that I understand, because if I'm gonna to formulate an opinion on something, I better guide in the right direction people. That's kind of like the way I see it. I don't like to give, hyped information without prior knowledge. I do review certain gear, early on. Like for example, I was lucky enough to get the 20 to 70 L like lens. And, I was pretty straightforward with that review, but I'm very familiar with the lens because I was using the Sigma version and it's optically exactly the same thing, right? So, yeah, I think, first of all, I make no money with YouTube. Very little, because I don't chase the algorithm. I don't, review just to comply with the hype. I review things that I find interesting myself, and I think that has been the nature of my YouTube channel. That it's very niche. I don't review everything that comes out. I review certain particular cameras because are the cameras that I use, and I just like to have that honest approach with my videos.
And one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of your work involves street photography, and you mentioned that you do portraiture as well. And something that maybe you can share with listeners is, a lot of times people will go to a new city, whether it's on vacation or they're just happen to be traveling, and they want to photograph in that city, and they really have an inclination to do that, but they almost don't even know where to start.
Right.
So if and I'll use Miami or New York City as examples. When you get home to Miami, or you go to a new place, or a place you've traveled before, perhaps like New York, or maybe others, if you have an example, you've got your camera, you're ready to go, but how do you decide where you want to go first? How do you kind of suss out the city to be able to get out there and increase your likelihood of finding images?
Like I mentioned to you very early on before, I kind of go with the flow. But going with the flow doesn't mean shoot anything or just, spray and pray. Going with the flow is, to me, kind of like becoming the environment. And what I mean by this is I hear a lot of the times people say, oh, there's nothing to shoot in my town. And I've been to those towns that there are nothing to shoot. And to me, there's a lot to shoot. So I think that a lot of the times, we get visual fatigue of our surrounding, and that actually refrain us from appreciating the world with a different eye. And I think that's exactly it. We need to start perceiving things with a different eye. And what I mean becoming the environment is that if you feel that you're in a city that is boring, or if you feel that you are shooting in a bad weather, embrace it. That's what I try to do. For example, as you've seen, I travel a lot to New York because of work, and I happen to be there, and there's a lot of things to shoot in New York. It's something that have been happening to me as well, and I'm trying to combat. New York can also become monotonous. It could become, oh, I shot it all, right? So you always have to reinvent yourself, become the environment, and kind of like become the story that you want to tell that day. Because what I mean by this is that you're going to start perceiving the world not as it is, but as you want to see the world. And to me, that's photography. I shoot to create my own stories. I don't document the story that we all see. And again, it's my approach. I like to create, these new realities through the lens. And when, at least, that works for me, may not work for others, but when you actually set your mind to that, let me create a story from what's in front of me, then you'll start thinking, and approaching your photography in a different way. And it's going to take some practice to get there, because you have to kind of like erase that mentality that we're born with, that something that I see too often is boring, and you have to reinvent yourself. In fact, I remember during COVID, during the lockdown, nobody wanted to even go out. And I was at my house in an apartment. I used to live in an apartment before, and I started shooting things in my house, and I even got COVID, and I was for a week in a bedroom, and I had my camera, a bottle of water, and I started shooting like different things in my bedroom from different lenses, using wide angle. And that goes to show you that a lot of the time constraint is also a creative resource to create better photos. So I don't believe that there are nothing to shoot. I think that there are creators a blockage that could happen sometime, and It's kind of like something that you have to address first rather than look around and say, oh, what am I going to shoot? I think that first you need to kind of like deprogram your brain and ask yourself, what can I create with this crappy weather today? Let's just embrace it. Or the city that with very few people living, not much going on. I mean, there's something going on. There's a sky, there's a tree, there's a street. There's always going to be something to shoot. So you gotta program your brain, into this new way of perceiving and deprogram your way of taking reality for granted per se.
Well, and I think, one example of that are some of the things that you do and some others have done, and that is change physically the way you're looking at the scene. So many times photographers look at eye level at what's around them, and you really do a great job of getting low and shooting up, or getting up higher and shooting down. But that can take the mundane that you're used to and you see
Right.
every day and make it look completely different.
Yeah, if you look at some of my photos unconsciously, they are always shot almost ground level, or kind of like my from my waist or even below, and that alone puts me at a complete different perspective than the average human being, because obviously, we're taller than that, and that alone changes the game. That alone, it's a different story. It's a different story perceived from a different perspective, and a lot of the times I will go throughout the whole day shooting like that.
Well, and that begs the question. When you leave that hotel room in whatever city you're in, are you typically? I have an inclination here, but I'm going to ask you: are you typically a guy who's going to pick a prime and put that on? Are you going to have a couple of primes in a bag? Or are you going to go with one zoom and call it good for the day? What's your lens choice or choices that you typically will use?
Yeah, so for street and travel, I like to go with one or two lenses max. There may be a rare occasion where I may have an ultra wide angle, like a 21 or even wider, but usually it's a 35 and a 50 or a 28 and a 50. And I decide that before I go, and I'm like, these are going to be my constraint. And I'll tell you why. The 50 is a lens that I use in a rare case. If I am going to, like for example, in New York, I like it because I like to do a lot of portraits, street portrait, and I like to shoot wide open. When it comes to portrait, I would like to create that background separation in the subject, and a 50 gets me there, a lot easier than with most lenses. But a lot of the times, I bring the 35 Apple that has a close focus of 0.3 meters, and that's what I use for everything, and it is one lens. And when I think that I want to bring something extra wide is if I'm going to a place where I know that there are going to be, for example, cathedrals, or like if I go to the Oculus, I just want to create using that kind of perspective. But it's something that I kind of plan, ahead of time. Otherwise, I go out with one or two lenses. 35 is my go-to focal length. If I have to pick one, it's going to be a 35, you know.
Yeah, and I tend to gravitate towards that. I was recently in Hanoi, Vietnam, and I had done some research, and just seemed like it's a relatively crowded city with a lot going on, lots of people kind of up right in front of you, and so that's where I walked around with a 28 because everything was right in front of you, and it
Correct.
wasn't like you didn't have to get in the face, so to speak, of people.
Yes.
People are in your face, and so the 28 was just the lens for me. But then, there's times when I'm in New York City where either the 35 or like the 43, like the Q3 43, I could just walk around all
Yeah.
day and night with that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I remember not too long ago, I was in New York, and there was a protest, against Elon Musk and Trump. They were by the Tesla store there, and I just went down with a 28,
Yeah.
and that's it. And I was walking around, and I actually happened to shoot down low, shooting up, and most of the picture was shot that way with a 28 without creating a lot of, additional tension on the crowd. We'll walk around and kind of glance at the framing and shoot, and that's what I did. Zone focus and a 28, so it's a very good combination for that type of photography.
Now, and also, when you're shooting with the wider lens, and you're shooting from a little bit lower than eye level, it makes everything seem taller and bigger and grander. and in some cases more intimidating. And so, when you're shooting a protest, which can be intense anyway, and you're shooting from a somewhat lower to up perspective, it really not
Yeah.
over dramatizes, but it probably accurately
Yeah.
illustrates, the intensity of what's going
Yeah.
on. That's like a perfect lens and a perfect angle.
Specifically, facial expressions. They are
Yes.
much more accentuated from the bottom. In my opinion, I was in another rally in Switzerland, in Zurich last year, and I happened to be with some friends from the Leica store, Zurich, having some dinner and everything. And in my bag, I had a 20A, and on the camera, I had a 50. And all of a sudden, I hear, kind of like a chant coming from the background, and I turn around and I see massive amount of people. We order pizza and everything. I just swap lenses and run into the crowd, and again, with a 20A, I capture great great images. It was about the some protests about the Middle East, and gender equality and all that stuff. So I dove into the crowd and started shooting photos.
And you mentioned a couple things that don't necessarily you don't necessarily think of as going together. So I'm thinking there's probably different instances for each of these. So you mentioned that you like to shoot wide open quite frequently, and then you also mentioned using zone focus, which typically
Yeah,
you're stopped down to have
correct.
more in focus. So maybe you could kind of talk through the situations in which you want to shoot wide open
Yeah,
versus zone focus, where maybe you're at f8, f9,
yeah.
thereabouts. Kind of like what those different use cases are.
Yeah, sure. So the wide open approach is usually for portraiture, mainly for portraiture or still life sometimes. But to shoot street, I'm at f11 religiously.
Hmm.
And as the light diminish, I may go FA. But even at night, I don't like to shoot at f1.4, for example, because I just don't like it. Just to shoot with a 35 at f 1.4 for street photography. Generally, I don't like it. I like to be, with a very narrow depth of field. So I will go actually, to f11 is where I like to stay. And one of the reasons why I also embrace monochrome sensor cameras, because they have a great ISO performance, and even a lower light situation, I can hover between the FA and f11 and still get a very clean shot. But when it comes to portraiture, like I mentioned before, that's when I really enjoy that background separation, because obviously I want the portrait to be the main thing, not looking into layering too much. So I'm actually looking to separate things from the main subject. And for that, shooting wide open, it's always a preference for me. But everything else, why? Especially like you mentioned, zone focus. The smaller your aperture hole, the easier it is to gauge distance, and the wider the lens, also it improves your odds of nailing that.
You're doing so many things in photography, whether it's shooting or providing advice or developing products, and yet you were not a classically trained photographer. And I know that probably your first exposure, which sounds like a pun intended, but it actually wasn't, to photography is through your father.
Sure.
Maybe kind of share how that began, your introduction to photography as a kid growing up.
Yeah, so I've been around for quite some time, and I was born in a time that there was not digital cameras, right? So my dad always had a camera with him. If we would go to a family gathering, boom, he had a camera hanging. So seeing a person, a human being that I look up to with a camera, was kind of like a role model to me. And I always wanted to be, big when I was small. I always wanted to pretend to be big and try to steal my dad's camera all the time. But my dad was very protective of his camera. So to shoot with a camera was something that I wanted to do, but I didn't have the liberty just to go and grab his camera, because he will be really mad at me. But he gave me one time one of his cameras, and I remember it was a Canon. I believe it was a Canon A1.
Oh,
That was the
wow.
first time that he told me, stop shooting. First, you need to focus. See that little thing right there? You gotta make sure that looks really sharp, and then you hit that. So he made me aware of appreciate every exposure at an
Mhm.
early age. And I'm never gonna forget my first creative photo. I believe I was 8 years old, and I was in a city. I believe it was the city in Argentina called Mar del Plata, means silver sea. And it was my dad that he was with his palm like this. He was extending his palm, and I wanted to put my two cousins on his palm.
Oh, nice.
And,
Okay.
and I told him to go far away, and there was this little ledge that they stood up, and I was guiding my dad, lower your hand, and I took that photo. I need to find that photo because I don't know if my mom has it there or where it is, but we still keep all the photos. But that was my first creative photo, and I remember that my mom always said, "Wow, you have an eye for photography. When you grow up, you should look into." And that stuck to me. So every time I saw a camera or an opportunity to shoot, I kind of like took the advice of my mom that maybe this is for you. And that's how I got introduced to photography. And I always, then later on I went to graphic design school, and photography was a very important tool for me. And at that time, I would do actually a lot of packaging, for companies, and we would have to shoot with film, scan it, and put that image on packaging for customers. So then, the creative side of photography, or the experimental point of photography became a tool that I actually use from that day on until now to make a living per se.
So you first get introduced to photography because your dad, who you looked up to, has a camera and he's sort of giving you some core fundamental things to think about. In addition to him, who would you say are, whether it's mentors in a literal sense or it's inspiration, in books or movies, documentaries? Who else kind of helped continue that interest and that passion in photography?
Honestly, I've never, for my early days, look into others people work. I would glance photography books, just to see what was out there. But I never had in my early days kind of like an inclination to review other people's work, consistently. And it wasn't until I started taking photography seriously that I'm like, well, let me see what someone else is doing out there. And one of my favorite photographers is Sal Leiter. I
Mhm.
love his work. Bruce Davison, Cartier-Bresson. The usual, old school. But I try to stay away from personally now contaminating myself or oversaturating myself with information, because I find myself that when I observe something too much, I'm very obsessive with everything I do. And I'm afraid that that obsession would actually distort the way I see things. So I really take it very lightly when it comes to books. And like I showed you the other day, I have quite a collections of book that sometimes I'm like, should I go and take a look at this one? Okay, let's go. It's been a while. But yeah, Saul Leiter is a photographer that I really admire.
And so many of those classic legendary photographers like Bresson and just so many of them, the photos you see are black and white.
Yep.
And that's a function of several things, whether it's availability of color film, cost of developing color film, feeling like black and white film was just a better medium to showcase what they were shooting. So from your perspective, what sort of environments really call for monochrome versus ones where you feel that color would best showcase whatever it is that you're shooting?
All right. So throughout my whole life, I shot mostly color, even film, mostly color. And to me, photography was meant to be in color, was until not too long ago, maybe 4 years ago, that I decided to experiment and take monochrome more seriously. And something that you just said, that most of these people that I admire, their photography was black and white. And in my head, when looking at this work, I always took black and white photography as kind of like an outdated way of representing
Hmm.
photography. And I was like, okay, well, that's the way they used to do it before because they didn't have color. Although Lighter, also experimented with color. But I took kind of like the old way of doing things, and always, felt that photography should have been consumed in color. But it wasn't until really started taking street photography more seriously. And I shared with you before, when I sold my studio, so closed down my studio, I didn't sell it, closed down my studio, after COVID, my landlord jacked up the rent and said, well, from now on, you pay double the rent. And I'm like, I can't do it. So either we work something else or I'm going to have to walk out. I was like, oh, well, you're on your own. Of course, a lot of people wanted to rent the space. So I was on my own. And at that time, I was doing a lot of portrait photography, and my portraiture was always in color. And I kind of like got into a rebellious moment where I was like, you know what? If the studio, if the technicality of having to shoot models and being perfect and razor sharp and the G Master and all that stuff, I was like, I'm just gonna shoot what I want. I don't care if I don't get paid, and most likely I won't get paid. And I started shooting photos, and then I said, you know what? And F color photography too. Let's change things up. And I like to constrain myself. And I found black and white to be a nice constraint. So what I started doing is I started shooting color, converting in black and white. Then I felt like cheating. That's just not black and white. If it works in black and white, then the picture would actually be consumed, printed, or posted in black and white. And then I'm like, you know what? I am going to start shooting with a rear screen in black and white, even though, I use the viewfinder, but even the viewfinder, whether it is electronic or optical, electronic, you could actually see the photo in black and white as the photo is happening. Whereas, with M cameras, for example, digital, you have to look at the back of the screen. And when I started doing that, I realized, and it goes back to what we said in the beginning, I realized that shooting black and white is not about choosing the film in black and white or choosing the film simulation on the digital in black and white. Shooting black and white is thinking in black and white. Because what I noticed is that when I was converting color pictures, my photography approach was color, was perceiving color. And the photo turned into black and white after I got home, and I was gone from that location. So I never felt happy with the results. Why? Because because my brain was thinking in color, and things don't work that way in black and white. So when it comes to black and white, I give you an example, and I think we talked about that a while back. But if you look at cyan and pink or magenta, a lot of the times when you convert that into black and white, they actually are gray, and sometimes are the same gray. So that pop that you had in color and that contrast separation no longer exists in black and white. And I understood that, when I decided to experiment with black and white, I'm like, you know what? Let's take it a step further. Let's go monochrome all the way. And that's when I picked up my very first, that was a Leica M10, then a Q2 monochrome. And then from there, film, black and white, and the whole nine yard. And I just never looked back. And I was like, there are going to be situations that I am going to feel the FOMO because I may be in a situation that's very colorful and I'm going to regret it. And again, it's making it work and framing your head that, to perceive the world in black and white. And that really helped me to get a lot happier with my photography. And again, when I shoot color and when I shoot black and white, I have to hit a switch every single time in my head to get the level of impact that I'm looking for.
I have gone back and forth myself in terms of color versus monochrome. And, when I think of the area you live in Miami, like, for example, I would think that number one, making the case for black and white shooting in Miami is you have some very strong sun, which creates light and shadow. You have various Art Deco buildings. You have palm trees that are unique shapes. So on one hand, I think that would be incredible monochrome photography. The other side of my brain says, what a colorful city.
Yeah.
Incredible colors from neon to others. And if I shoot black and white, then I don't have the colors, which to me are very indicative of telling the story of South Florida. So I get that what would they call it, paralysis by analysis. Like what do I do? So what I would do is I would probably shoot in monochrome JPEG, but then also have shooting in raw as well. So I retain the color, because I do think that some images that look great in one look just okay in the other. And you figure out whether the landing spot should be black and white or color. But is that cheating, or do you see where my dilemma comes from? Whether it's Tuscany in Italy, similar situation with the colors and the shadow, Miami, Rio, there's many cities, but whereas when I go to New York City, I think monochrome. I don't even have to think
Yeah.
twice about that.
Yeah.
So how would you help a desperate me trying to figure out which I shoot given the subject?
No, I think it all comes down to personal choice. There is not one of the things that I like about photography, that there are not rules. There are not rules. So again, it all depends if you shoot for your own enjoyment, or you shoot for other, people enjoyment. I shoot personally for me. I need to be happy with what I do. It's actually something that I always think with anything I do in life. If I don't enjoy it, I don't want to take part of it. So, I do shoot color from time to time, mostly for the YouTube channel to like maybe reveal lens, because people are gonna be like, black and white, So I happen to shoot more in color, when I do things for the channel in mind. But it's a matter of choice. I don't think there is a better way to do it than the other. I personally like to have that commitment. So if I'm gonna go to say travel to a place, I bring the black and white camera, and that's what I shoot. But I always travel with several cameras. And one little camera that I love, because it gives me a lot of flexibility in those FOMO situations, is the Deluxe 8. So I have that camera. It takes no space, 24 to 70, 75 equivalent. If there's something that is so good, I'm like, just, bust the Deluxe and take a photo just to get it out of the system. For now, I want to continue shooting black and white. And for those color days, also there is the iPhone. And yes, indeed,
Yeah.
right now there, I've taken a lot of pictures that I even post on Instagram on the iPhone, and I do that. Yeah.
Well, I would think that there's probably more photos that people take, and let alone post, that are shot on a camera on your phone than any other camera, actual camera that's out there.
The most popular camera out there is the iPhone.
Yeah, yeah. We were talking about your YouTube channel and the things that you do, and all of that becomes part ultimately of social media. And as social media has grown from back in the early days with the MySpaces of the world and some of those early things, a lot has evolved in general, and a lot has evolved specifically around photography. So, I mean, overall, on balance, would you say that social media has been good or a negative for photography and really advancing the knowledge and appreciation of it?
Yeah, I think that social media has a lot to do with more people daring to grab a camera and take photos for good or not so good reasons. But yeah, it also has helped me discover a lot of photographers that are not the ones that we used to look up to before. There are some regular people like you and me that I admire today,
Mm-hmm.
and I admire their work. So it allowed me to discover new photographers that I enjoy their work. It allowed me to share my work with the world, without having to polish a book or whatever. And yeah, I think overall, has been very positive. Like I mentioned as well before, we are extremely saturated at the same time with photography because of social media. I think it's a tool that you need to know how to use it, right? And how to let it affect your life. Okay, there are a lot of photographers, and I see in the comments, and I get messages that creates a lot of stress. Social media for some photographers. For example, I was replying to someone the other day that asked me, "Oh my God, I have this camera, and I tried this camera because I saw it in your channel, and I bought also that lens, but send me a couple of black and white pictures that he shot." but I cannot, like he was stressed out about the outcome of his photo. And I'm like, take it slow, practice, don't give up. And I even edited a JPEG that he sent me, recorded my screen. And because he was asking me what software you use and this and that. I'm like, look, listen, sometimes I just edit on my phone. So I actually went to photos from my phone with his photo, and I was moving the slider just to show him a little bit, how I like to fine tune some of my photos. But that guy was messaging me, and seemed to be really stressed out about the outcome. And I think that a lot of the times people worry more about the technical execution than the actual composition of a picture,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and yeah, so gotta be really careful with how you let it affect you.
Well, I agree, and I think it's one thing if you're a photographer who is working on an ad campaign or a specific thing like that, and clearly there's expectations, there's money changing hands as compared to someone who just enjoys photography. It's a hobby. It's a distraction. It's a focus. Even if you're a serious hobbyist and you absolutely love it, and I hope you do, but like give yourself a break. Don't
Deserve a
take
break.
something that is about enjoyment and get yourself so worked up that you just can't be satisfied.
One of the things that I tell people is that if you want to take photography seriously, don't take it seriously.
It's good
That is my
advice.
advice. That is my advice to people because, and it is my example of photography. I mentioned before I had a studio, very, very technical, the type of photography that I was doing for catalogs, for models and the light and the hair and and all that stuff. And I had enough. And then I decided to take photography seriously, but without all that technicality and really enjoying. So I
Hmm.
felt, honestly, with street photography, I felt liberated. Okay, there is a platform, there's a style of photography that doesn't require me to be stressed out about every single aspect of, a photo. And that's why I enjoy so much just shooting the street.
And I want to speak into that. I want to ask you a question that I always like to talk to street photographers about. And that is, you have people who are photographers and they recognize that, people are fascinating and people do interesting things. They do weird things. And it's kind of, it's a fun subject matter. But some people will say, I don't feel comfortable photographing strangers on the street. I don't feel comfortable saying, is it okay if I make a portrait of you? But at the same time, I also don't feel comfortable taking pictures of people without permission. So, how do you sort of navigate street photography that involves other people in the pictures that you don't know? How do you handle that in terms of ask permission, don't ask permission, what's the right distance, what's appropriate, what's respectful, what's okay, what's not okay? How do you, and the answer is different for everybody, but how do you sort of define that for you?
It's a great question. And often I get asked, do you know those people? No. Most of the people I shoot, I've never seen them before. And there is another component with capturing portraits, for example, of people on the streets. Because of course, like capturing something from a distance, wide open, there's not much risk involved than when you get really close within a few centimeters away from them. And there is another aspect of photography that you have to master, and at least for myself, because first of all, I do respect people's privacy. And there are certain photos that I don't want to take, of certain people, or of certain people with certain lifestyle. I just respect their space, their current situation. Those photos that I do want to take, my approach, it's always with the utmost respect. Kind of like the opposite of some other photographers. Mine is with the approach of the utmost respect. And if I see a character that is very interesting that I want to capture a photo, I would approach him and say, man, you look really, and I just want to document this. And I would go with this friendly approach. And I offer always to send the picture to them. If they have an Instagram, if they want a print or I can send a print, I always like to offer that. And often complimenting someone helps. But at the same time, there are photos that you cannot ask for permission. And if there is a situation of, I don't know, a guy on a horse and, you're not going to ask the guy, you may get kicked by the horse. And at that time, you just got to use judgment. Do I take this picture? I don't take this picture. And yes, photography is also about navigating uncomfortable moments, right? And uncomfortable situations. And a lot of the time you got to pull down and say, you know what, this picture needs to be taken. I'm taking this picture. When it comes to a portrait, which is more of what I do on the streets, I like to make sure that I'm not invading their privacy. Otherwise, I don't want to have a picture in my portfolio of someone that otherwise may have opted for not having that picture taken very up close. I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Not a situation. Like, for example, I discovered by accident that a lot of the photos I take, people are smoking something. They're smoking stuff, so I'm like, wait a second, why am I doing this? I was reviewing my collection in library, and I'm like, this guy's smoking, this guy's smoking, this guy's smoking, this guy's smoking. And yeah, I find that awesome. And most of those photos were actually approached and asked for permission. And I'm like, just do your thing, do what you were doing. One of the things that I don't like is someone posing for the photo. And I always emphasize, keep doing what you're doing. You're good. I'm just capturing this photo, blah, blah, blah. And, I'll, at the same time, I try to take it as natural as possible. So it takes a little bit of psychology and mindset to, pour that into the subject and have them trust you, because there are a lot of people that you're going to want to shoot that may not be having the best moment in their lives, and you got to be mindful of that.
Well, and, building a rapport with a potential subject that, doesn't know you at all, and making a connection in the space of literally 15 seconds, to where they don't know you and vice versa. You introduce yourself, you ask if it's okay. And that might even be a 5 or 8 second decision that person makes. And, there's always that, I don't know if it's a debate, but that question of, if you ask permission, then often that person will pose. And what you want is the person that you saw before you even spoke to them in a natural moment. So it's like this, it's a potential trade-off, taking a photo that was really going to be great and turning it into just somebody smiling and saying cheese.
Yes. And if you take a look at some of the portraits, they actually, some of the portraits that I've captured, the latest one, they're actually represent the moment as I've seen it the first time. And one of the things that I do is, while I'm approaching them, I don't go with my hands down and, excuse me, I go with the camera in my eye already. Hey, do you mind if I take this picture? Stay there, keep doing what you're doing. Hey, you look amazing, boom, snap the photo. So you kind of steal it, but at the same time, you get their consent. And again, like I mentioned before, you got to use your psychology, because you don't want to bust that moment. You don't want them to break out and start work. So they got to trust you. I often smile as I'm approaching them with a grin in my face. Oh, that's awesome. Let me see, boom, and capture this picture. Most of the picture of people smoking, sometimes they're smoking weed, and some people may not want to be photographed, but I manage through the way I approach them to make them feel comfortable. Keep doing what you're doing, boom, 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 boom. There's one of my favorite photos that I captured a while ago of this girl in New York City doing sunset hour. And it looked like she was waiting for someone to take the picture. Everything was perfect. The light blasting her face, the smokiness, the way she was dressed, her hair, her face, everything was perfect. So I just went and run into her pretty, like literally without spooking her. And she saw me coming, and I smiled at her. And then she took another hit, and boom, and we started shooting. All of a sudden, she got it. A lot of the time you build a connection, like an instant connection with a stranger that you never met. And I've been lucky enough to come across a lot of those situations where, I don't know, where like if that moment was meant to happen for both the photographer and the subject, and they do what they're doing. And I'll send you some pictures so you can take a look at them.
That's great.
That particular moment was a very special moment. I've never seen her again.
Well, you and I, when we had our podcast pre-call, we talked about how I think, well, you and I connect to this. We don't like a lot of things when they're super easy. If it's just push a button and it's almost, you can't mess it up. And, over the last several years, especially, I feel like I'll call it the simplification of cameras has gotten to, that's a great picture. Yeah, we'll have to show that so people who are listening to the podcast can check that out. but yeah, it's gotten so easy that the phrase "everyone's a photographer," has become even more present than it is now. And I think that technical aspects of photography, understanding them, are still important, and I think they can be real difference makers. But I think that the number of technically bad pictures might be less because the camera is doing so much of the thinking that the photographer used to do. And that brings me to your appreciation for manual focus versus autofocus, decision making versus, every setting should be on auto. And I think that realistically has at some point in your photographic journey led you to Leica as a
Yeah.
brand that you really, really appreciate, because you can be as technically advanced as you want, but you can also be kind of old school where you are making the majority, if not all, the decisions. So, how has that been that you sort of, turned away a bit from almost everything is done for you, and really prefer more of you making many more of those decisions behind the camera?
Yeah, so the way I see a timeline, right? I see a timeline when I first picked up my first camera, my first memories of picking up a camera, film cameras. You have 36 exposure. Once it's over, you gotta load another roll. You gotta send that to development. Doing that created a little bit also of tiredness, and then for me, and then when I realized that there were cameras that you don't have to put rolls, save me money there. When there are cameras that I don't have to send the film to be developed, I actually completely abandoned film photography at that time and early 90s, I mean late 90s, and went full blast with digital cameras. And I started shooting with the first Sony cameras with a purple memory stick. I recall those were some of the first one that I shot. So I embraced Sony cameras since the very early days. Before the Sony A7, the very first one, I was already shooting with Sony cameras. And then I started getting more involved with portraiture and more of the product photography for my own brands that I owned before. And at that time, it was all about getting the fastest focus, the utmost resolution possible, the best color sign possible. So I happened to go from one extreme to the other, film to uber technical cameras. The smarter the camera, the better. Fast forward a bunch of years, started not being motivated by photography. And I realized that I had lost everything that made photography fun, which was the manual human component of it. Me having to load a film, me having to risk of messing up a photo out of focus and I wouldn't find out after, a couple of days later when I get the film and all that stuff. Pivoting point was when I actually closed down my studio. Like I mentioned before, I closed down my studio how long ago? 2019, I believe it was. So when I closed down my studio is when I kind of like replanned my strategy, my approach to photography, because I felt like never taking a photo again. It was
Wow.
a very, yeah, it was a very sad moment for me because I had that studio. I built it from the ground up, and I even had a cyclorama in the back of the
Mm.
studio, a quarter. It was a pretty big, like a quarter corner like that, cyclorama. And I was like, oh man, all this money, all this years, all these photos, all this gear invested, and now I don't have a studio again. I knew that that feeling was a feeling of the moment, and that there was going to be a way for me to overcome it and fall in love. So I decided to reassess my approach for photography, and a friend of mine introduced me to Leicas. Obviously, I always knew Leica cameras, but I never thought they were for me. I thought they were for other people that were here before me. He actually let me borrow his Leica M10 and told me, yeah, just take it for a few days, And I took that camera and I took it for a week, and then he's like, give it to me back on Sunday. So I call him up and say, hey, I have your camera. Thank you for letting me borrow. And he's like, what do you think about it, man? Wow. It felt like learning photography all over again, you know?
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
actually, pretty interesting. And he's like, you want to keep it for a little bit more? I'm like, no, 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 just take the camera. And I give him the camera. And from the moment I gave him that camera, all I did is was thinking about that M10. I didn't even want to look at my Sony cameras anymore. And I thought about all my, I was thinking about all the photos that I taken, and I would go on the computer and review. And I'm like, wow, man, why they look so different? Is it the camera? Is it the lens? No, it was the approach that was different. I realized it was the approach, it was the mindset of capturing photos with a camera where a lot of things can go wrong when you shoot with this, even though they're digital, right? But a lot of things can go wrong with this. You don't have an electronic viewfinder, you don't have autofocus. So there's no one to blame of the outcome than yourself. And I love that. Once again, it's taking responsibility and accountability for the result. And that I loved, the challenge of constraint. That's what I would call that. I think the challenge of constraint is what always kept me interested on something, or kept me obsessive about perfecting the outcome. So yeah, from that moment on, it was over, man. Like, let me show you all that stuff. That row right there that you see, it's all Leica cameras from the Leica 1
Oh,
all the
wow.
way to, yeah. So I never looked back. I started selling my Sony gear. I sold all my G Master lenses. Well, I have some lenses, I gotta say, because I use them for video. But yeah, and I got my first like M10 monochrome actually, and then I got a Q2 color, Q2 monochrome, and from that moment on, it was on for me. I'm like, this is the platform for my photos, and it was a combination of mindset and the right tool for that mindset. Mhm.
There's so many, brands out there that really make really good cameras, whether it's Nikon, Canon, Fuji, Sony. I mean, there,
Everybody.
you could add more, but I kind of feel like, as good as those brands are, unless you're an ambassador specifically for those brands, buying the camera, buying the lenses, it's a transactional experience. Whereas it seems like with Leica, it's a bit more of a community,
Oh yeah.
and a history, and a rich history of, innovation and so forth. And do you feel, sort of part of that community, whereas maybe you didn't really think much of any kind of community with a Sony or some brand you shot previously?
I've never experienced the Leica cult, the Leica, let's go like that, with any other brand out there.
Yeah.
No other brand give a damn about me in the past. And Sony, man, I probably supported a lot of families at Sony because I had so many Sony cameras and lenses. Every lens that would come out, I would own it. Nothing. Never got like I was unnoticed to the brand.
Mhm.
And one of the things that Leica does to their customers, they make them feel acknowledged, and I love that. I love that. I love that you go to a Leica store and it feels like at home. They make you feel at home. I love that.
Yeah.
And I like to collect watches. Back in the days, buying a watch was similar, and it reassembles a little bit of that. But with Leica, it's different. A lot of my friends are people that work at Leica stores now.
Yeah.
People that I call friends, people that I pick up the phone and talk to. A lot of the good friends I have, I met them through the camera. Through
Yeah.
going to a show, through some other guys on YouTube. So yeah, great. It actually not only changed my approach to photography, the M system, but it also changed my approach to friendship, I would say. It's funny to say, I met you, for example.
Yeah.
I met a lot of people last week. We went to eat with my girlfriend with another YouTuber, Alex Barrera.
Mhm.
He actually moved down to Miami because of me and something that we were going to be doing together. Now he's doing something else, but and we became really good friends for now a couple of years. And yeah.
Yeah, that's great. It really builds a sense of community. So, you have this creative side of your brain, and you also have, aside from the creative side, you definitely have a business side as well. And with the company you founded, Owl Crown, you've been able, I think, to kind of merge those two, the business side with the creative side, because a lot of people don't have both. They really have one or the other primarily. I mean, we all have both, but one is dominant generally, and the other is recessive. And so, what was the spark that made you want to start creating, these absolutely gorgeous camera straps of various varieties, and thumb grips, and I mean, it's like a rabbit hole of things you can develop. But what made you kind of want to go down that path?
To give you a little bit of context on what I used to do for a living on a daily basis, I owned a brand that I founded myself in my garage. in 2007 making tattoo machines. So, I've been tattooing since I was 15 years old. I started a brand in my garage. Fast forward 2019, the business got acquired. I remain, as an investor of the fund, and I was the lead innovation officer of the business and the lead mechanical engineer. I went to school for graphic design, and I taught myself how to design with SolidWorks. That's how I actually create all the products with a company. And from a very rudimentary tattoo machine to a very advanced tattoo machine that looked like a pen, that had a screen that you could talk through a phone and, hey Siri, go up, go down, stop, and all that stuff. So the engineering industrial designer aspect comes from this prior venture that lasted about 2003 to 2019, and I remained until 2024. So do the math there. I'm very bad at math. It comes from there. So I actually, as part of the building of that company, I started thinking about self-sustaining my manufacturer, because I would work actually at the beginning with shops nearby, CNC shops that can mill out parts out of aluminum. And we ended up with 22 CNC machines. And the business decided to relocate to another state because the business was in Miami after the acquisition. They actually went to Baltimore, to Maryland. Yeah, in Baltimore. They're in Baltimore now, the headquarters, in Coca-Cola Drive.
Yep, not far from here.
Yeah. So they didn't have any use for this current manufacturer. It was a lot cheaper just to do everything elsewhere than moving all these gigantic machines. And I approached them, and I'm like, I want to reacquire the assets. What are we talking about? And we struck a very good deal, very hard to pass onto. So I'm like, that's it. This closed the circuit, because all this time shooting photos, I wish I could do this for the camera. Oh, I wish this little thing would have been like, oh, I wish this strap was this way. Oh, I wish this, and all this I wish from a designer, industrial designer, mechanical engineer. I started designing a lot of products in my head throughout all these years that I wish that existed. Or if a product exists, I'm like, what about if this was done in a different way? So I pretty much bit the bullet, and I decided to do this and manufacture camera equipment here in Miami, Florida. That was my starting point. Just like back then, I'm like, I want to create this product, not overseas. I want to create it here by my neighborhood. And same thing with this. And little by little, I started with straps because it was something that I consider very important in photography or videography. It's the gear that holds thousands of dollars. It's you relied on that, and it has to be comfortable. Specifically for me, that when I walk on the street to take photos, sometimes I walk for 10 hours straight. And I do that for a period of time. Comfort and ability to adjust and go. And it was very important. I never found a strap that would actually deliver that type of performance. So I started like twinkling. At the time, I lived in my apartment. And then when I moved to this facility, I expanded a little bit more with machinery, to cut the leather and all that stuff. And started with Al Crown. And soon after, I started making some of the parts out of aluminum, brass, and things like that. And there is a huge pipeline of products that I've been working now more than a year that are now being under production, like grips to enhance ergonomics for the camera, fixturing and bracketing things. I'm actually building a new tripod head that is going to be all made out of brass. I'm going to bring a lot of things out of brass. I'm a sucker for brass. I like the brass material. I don't know why. And looks are kind of like important for me too, performance and look, I think that when you get to a point in your career, you start appreciating the gear as well. And that's where we are at right now.
Well, I think that, when you're investing, significantly in a camera body specifically, and your accessory really doesn't have the same durability, look, quality as the camera, it kind of looks like a cheap add-on. Even if it has functionality, it just kind of looks like something that got stuck on. And so, when you do make that investment in a camera body, if you have accessories that just look like they go along with it naturally, similar quality, similar look, then it looks like it's a match set, and it's not like an aftermarket, like I said, add-on. I mean, did you how long and hard did you kind of think about what these what these accessories need to not only function like, but what they need to look like so that they would be consistent in the look and feel with the bodies they attach to.
One of the things, the main philosophy on product design that I always had, and this comes from the prior business, the product or the accessory needs to look like part of the main product that you're trying to accessorize,
Mhm.
not like an add-on.
Yeah.
That is very crucial. Like, for example, some of the things that I'm building for the M system, when you look at an M camera, of course, it's a very simplistic and geometric shape, very distinctive. And the design language speaks for itself when you look at it. So when I try to build, like, for example, the new thumb grip with flash support, it needs to look like it belongs to the camera, not like it's a completely different product stuck together.
Mhm.
So design language is very important to me, and it's something that a lot of the time it represents the main holdup for product development, because until I nail the shape and form factor and everything looks like cohesive, I don't stop. Sometimes, I achieve the mechanical challenges of creating a product, and then what it takes the longest is refining the design so it looks right.
And I got to ask you because it's different. The company is Owl Crown, but
Correct.
Crown is with a K and not a
Okay.
C. What?
Yeah.
How did that come to be?
Uh, to be honest with you, I wanted to come up with a name that was going to be available as the URL, that I can get the URL as the name of the brand, that
Hmm.
I could get an Instagram, I could get a thread, Facebook. And my prior company, the name had a K as well.
Okay.
And I felt that I needed to have a K on this one. My prior company logo was a bird, and I felt that this one had to be a bird, but the evolution. And I always loved owls, and I knew that the name would have to do something with owl, because owls are, represent, a wise moment,
Sure.
peace, and all that stuff. And there's a good analogy about why I picked the owl. And then I don't know. I started just like mumbling things. All this, all that, all crown. Okay, that's it.
You just kind of noodle it and come up with it.
Yeah,
I mentioned a short time ago the evolution of cameras and so forth. Where we are now in technology and cameras and lenses. Where do you think the next leaps forward come in terms of cameras? It used to be it was about the more and more megapixels. Then it was autofocus speed, and now we have things that are sort of floating on the periphery of the photographic world, like AI and
yeah.
other things. But where do you think the next couple of evolutions are with cameras going forward?
I think the evolution is pretty clear where it's going, unfortunately or fortunately, however, you want to take it. But AI is here to stay, right? Just like digital photography came in and stayed.
Hmm.
And it changed photography, whether you like it or not, it changed photography. I don't know a lot of film sport photographers, anymore, right? So it
Yeah.
did change. It did change the mindset. It did change the industry. It did change the way we do business. I always thought that technology is going to get to a point where a camera is going to have one lens, and that lens, through artificial intelligence, through processing power, through resolution and resolving something in front, is going to reproduce anything. It's going to emulate the depth of field and all that stuff. Is going to be digital, I think. Just like before we had analog tapes, for music, and now you get super quality in the digital
Hmm.
format. So I think that it's going to get to a point where maybe it's not going to be a lens, maybe it's a sensor, some type of sensor that senses, I don't know, maybe
Yeah.
a mixture of lighter with something else, and everything else is going to be interpreted through artificial intelligence and represented with X focal length, X depth, f stop, and all that stuff. I think that that's going to be the moment or the evolution in photography moving forward, and processing power is probably what's holding it up right now.
Well, as we've got cameras now that have a fixed lens, but you've got digital zoom, and sometimes that digital zoom is 3 and 4 times magnification. And yes, the file sizes get smaller, but when you're starting at a 60 megapixel camera, if you bump that to 100 megapixel or 200 megapixel, then even when you've zoomed in 3 and 4 times, maybe that's a 20 or 30 megapixel photo, which is fine for almost every
Fine.
use case. Yeah. And it'd be interesting because the lens manufacturers would certainly have a vested interest in not having that all in one do it all camera.
Oh yeah, well, we know what happened to Kodak for having that type of mindset, right?
Sure.
No, 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 let's start focusing on film.
Right.
They're pretty much gone. But I think that you can adapt technology and evolution. That is something that you either embrace or you get left behind when it comes to technology and evolution. But that's what I think. I think photography is going to become even more accessible, probably even more affordable at one time. And I mean, I look forward to creating whatever tool are available, for as long as I live.
Yeah, no, it's exciting, and I know that people are going to look forward to seeing what you do going forward and what you comment on and talk about in YouTube and the other platforms. So, Gaston, I want to thank you for your generosity of time and being my guest today. And
I
I know
appreciate it.
that people who are listening are going to want to follow you on YouTube and all the various social media and Al Crown and everything you have going on there. What are the best places for people to check out what you have going on?
Sure. So I am on Instagram, Threads, and YouTube under at Gaston Shutters. And then Al Crown is also on Instagram, Thread, and we just started a YouTube channel at Al Crown. So OWLKROWN.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much. And I
Oh,
want to
thank you.
let all the listeners know, as usual, we publish on the 1st and the 15th of every month. We always enjoy hearing what you have to say. Feel free to, as they say, like and subscribe. It helps us get the word out and share that with everybody out there. I get many DMs on Instagram, people asking about places to go and cameras and lenses, and I welcome those inquiries. I get back to people pretty quickly. So I definitely invite you to continue doing that. On Instagram, of course, I'm Mitch Stringer Images, and you can also go online to mitchstringerimages.com. Until next time, when we have our next episode and another terrific guest like Gaston, I wish you great light. I wish you terrific shooting, and we'll talk again soon.